Hello and good afternoon, CTS265, Section 840 students for the Fall 2016 semester at Anne Arundel Community College. This is the CCNP route course, and this afternoon's video tutorial is going to be on Cisco Learning Labs Discovery Activity number 8. And this is the final discovery activity in which we're going to be discussing EIGRP. And very exciting activity here because we're going to discuss the EIGRP Named Mode. And specifically, we're going to look at how we can use the name mode and what benefits the name mode provides in terms of configuring EIGRP. Whereas before, with IPv4 and IPv6, EIGRP for v4 and v6, we had two mutually exclusive configuration sections. In fact, with EIGRP for v6, as we saw, we have to enable it under the interface, whereas with EIGRP for v4, we had to go ahead and use a network statement. There was no way to go under the interface and enable the EIGRP process. Now, one of the quick things to remember about named mode is EIGRP name mode is you'll hear it referred to as 64-bit mode, where when we now start to take a look at the metrics, right, the computed distance, the feasible distance, we're going to see that they are being calculated with a wide metric format that is 64 bits in value. And so the values that you're going to see, if you thought that the values that were 32 bits started to get a little unwieldy, the 64-bit values can become downright confusing just because there are so many numbers that sometimes will show up. So remember that there is backward compatibility. I can run EIGRP named mode and establish an adjacency without any issues with a router that is running legacy EIGRP, or I should say classic EIGRP, v4 or v6. So let's go ahead and jump into the activity here, and we'll have a couple of other points that are going to pop up. So first, let's come down to branch 2, and you can see we basically have the IPv4 and IPv6 addressing all the way through the environment. And one of the key things to remember is that unlike OSPF with address families, and we're going to kind of start to see the address families here with name mode. When you're doing OSPF with address families, the transport is IPv6. So, and that's very different from what we're going to be doing here with EIGRP. Remember, EIGRP, even in named mode, when we're doing IPv4, the transport is IPv4, which is why you see all of these basically dual stack, right? We're sort of set up as a dual stack here, where we've got v4 and v6 information every step of the way. Well, when we talk about OSPF with address families, which has a configuration similar to EIGRP named mode, when OSPF for IPv6, or I should say OSPF with address families is being used, that is using IPv6 as the transport, and the passenger protocols are v4 and v6. With EIGRP name mode, it's v4 over v4 and it's v6 over v6. It's not 4 over 6 or 6 over 4, right? So that's why we've got this dual stack configuration here. So let's go ahead and dive in, and let's go from user exec to privilege exec, and we're going to ping 192.168.1.1. And we're going to source that from our loopback 0 address. So from branch 2, what am I pinging? Exactly, I'm pinging the loopback over here, loopback 0 on branch 1 from the loopback on branch 2. And now let's also go ahead and try to ping the IPv6 address that's over there. So 2001:db8 :0:1::1. And actually didn't even need to source it from my loopback address. And again, we have full reachability. So let's take a look at the existing EIGRP configuration on branch 2. So show run section EIGRP. And as you can see, we've got two distinct sections here. We've got the IPv4 section, right, where we go in and configure things. And then we have under the interfaces here, we've got the IPv6 EIGRP autonomous system number. And then here's the global IPv6 section. So it's sort of discontiguous throughout the configuration, and it's even worse when you say show run, because instead of limiting it to what we're seeing, so you can see there's a command there, there's a command there, IPv6 EIGRP1 there, and then we come down, there's the IPv4 stanza for EIGRP, and then the IPv6 stanza, which I went right by, is right there. So again, it's kind of broken up and all over the file. And what name mode allows us to do is we're going to create a unified configuration section on the router. So what they're asking us to do in step 3, and this is interesting, in step 3 they're asking us to, let me see what version we're running here. Is it 15.4? It is not. It is version 15.2, and so that must be why they're having us do this. So in step 3, they actually want us to go ahead and go into global config and say no router EIGRP1 and no IPv6 router EIGRP1. And you'll notice something here, right? And this is another indicator that these EIGRP processes are mutually exclusive from each other, right? That it's v4 over v4 and v6 over v6, is that we're using the same autonomous system number for both v4 and v6. They do not have to be the same. In fact, I think, well, actually, yeah, when we go to recreate this, I'll use a different autonomous system number, because the autonomous system number doesn't go away just because you're using named mode. Now, typically what happens is when we pull the global EIGRP stanza out, it blows away, and yes, it did. And this is interesting. The lab actually then tells you to go into each interface and say no IPv6 EIGRP1. However, that happens auto-magically for you. When you blow the global stanza away, EIGRP is basically going to say, okay, well, it's clear that if you're blowing the global stanza away, that you don't need commands under the interfaces. And so it pulled those commands off of the interfaces as well. Okay, so here's what we're going to do now. So now what it's asking us to do, and let me make sure we get this right here. Yeah, so now what it's asking us to do is all the way down here on step 4, it's asking us to go ahead and use the name mode. Now, before we do that, and I don't actually have a router running 15.4 code. If you had 15.4 code, what you could do is you could come under the main process for IPv4 and IPv6. I could say router EIGRP1, and if I were to say EIGRP and put a question mark, the last option that you'll see with 15.4 code, I think it's 15.4.1, is right there. It will say upgrade-CLI. And this is an extremely convenient way to convert classic mode EIGRP configurations into named mode configurations. So I would come into the v4 stanza and type in EIGRP upgrade-CLI and hit enter, and then I would say IPv6 router EIGRP, and then, well, EIGRP AS, get that AS number in there, AS1, oh, I'm sorry, router EIGRP, and I need the do. And what is going on there? IPv6, what am I missing? Router, probably... Oh, I put AS, sorry, because we're going to need to do that here in a second. But yeah, so I'd say IPv6 router EIGRP1, and then I would simply say EIGRP upgrade-CLI, and that would convert the classic mode EIGRP configuration into the named mode configuration for both v4 and v6. But again, that's with 15.4 code. So here they've got us manually making those removals. So now let's get into the named mode configuration. So if I were to say router EIGRP and put a question mark, you can see that we can do what's called classic mode. It's also referred to as autonomous system mode. Because if I put a number here, whatever that number may be, I am indicating that I want to do classic autonomous system mode EIGRP, not named mode. The word is going to allow us to create a named mode process, and we'll stick with what they show, which is lab. So now once we're here, this introduces us to address families. And so I pick whatever, so let's say we're doing only IPv4. Well, then I would say address family, IPv4, unicast, autonomous system number, and then list out the number. If I was doing v6, I would say address family, IPv6. And again, it's going to keep it all under one stanza. So let's put that in for IPv4. Address family, IPv4, unicast. Now, unicast is the default, and you can get away without putting it in there. So we'll leave it in there. And you'll see here that the only thing I can do is either VRF, if we were doing a VRF, virtual routing and forwarding instance, or autonomous system. Now it says autonomous system. Let's see if it supports AS. And this is what I was thinking of earlier when I kept typing AS in there. So address family, IPv4, unicast, autonomous system number, and we're just simply going to use 1. Now, remember, I didn't delete what? Exactly, no router EIGRP 1, and then no IPv6 router EIGRP 1. So there we go, a little better. So now we'll go back in, router EIGRP lab, address family IPv4 unicast, AS 1. So now we're able to use autonomous system 1. So now under the address family mode, we have sort of a different set of commands that we're looking at here. Most notably is this AF interface. So if we want to do things under an interface, we do it from within the EIGRP Named Mode configuration under the address family for the address family that we are looking to manipulate. So we've started, and you'll see the network command is here for IPv4, right? So I'll just say network quad zeros, and we should have an adjacency establish or reestablish, and we do. So I say do show IP EIGRP neighbors, and there is the neighbor relationship. But what if I say do show IPv6, IPv6 EIGRP neighbors? So nothing with IPv6 yet because we haven't gone into the IPv6 address family. What does the topology table look like? Do show IP EIGRP topo. And there we go. We have our topology table, and let me go ahead and point out here, because you're probably looking at this saying, whoa, those are some incredibly large numbers down here for what is still the computed distance, and that is still, well, the reported distance is here. I drew it there, but we know that's the feasible distance because it says feasible distance is, reported distance is there, right? But take a look at the size of these metrics, like this last one down here, 196,608,000. Or this one here, 524,288,000. So these are some epically large metric values, right? But again, remember, it's because EIGRP named mode is scaling the metrics out on a 64-bit scale, as opposed to simply 32 bits, where we had values that were much, or I should say, that were easier to look at than these values here. It's very difficult to look at this and say, oh yeah, that probably goes in there roughly 1 time or 2 times. I mean, the numbers are quite big. So it definitely requires your full attention when you're taking a look at the topology table. All right, so if I were to say do show IP route, right? So the commands that you run for the verification and all that are still the same. The only thing that's different is when we go into the interface, or when we go into the autonomous system setup under named mode. So just like before, where I could say passive interface default, that would get done under AF interface default, and this represents all interfaces running the EIGRP process. So if I were to say passive interface default here, or actually it's just passive interface, I believe. Passive interface, it's going to tear my adjacency down, absolutely, out Ethernet 00, but now I say AF interface Ethernet 00, no passive interface. And now my adjacency comes back up. So instead of applying this in a global configuration area, like we did with EIGRP for IPv4, we would do the configuration here under the AF interface mode. Now, one of the commands that you're probably going to see that is always an interesting one is if I were to say do show IP EIGRP interfaces, we've got it, it's only running on the Ethernet 0, 0 interface. Now, if I were to create interface loopback 100 and then say IP address 10.1.2.3 and we'll make it a /24 and then go back into router EIGRP lab, address family IPv4 unicast AS1. You see I left unicast off and then shortened autonomous system just to AS, and that will work on the routers that we're working on the 2911 series. And then once I'm here, I'm going to say AF interface loopback, and I said 100. So do show, and the network statement should be covering this right now. So do show IP EIGRP interfaces, and it's not there. Did we? Oh, I passived it. Hold on. So say no passive interface. So now that I say no passive interface, sorry, I forgot to be the passive interface on the AF default. You'll see the loopback interface is now there. So when you passive an interface, that what it does is it's not sending the hellos on the interface, but it is advertising the interface. If I wanted to make sure that EIGRP was not running at all and it was not being advertised, I can simply say shut down. Now, here's what's interesting about this command, is it gives you the impression, you're like, well, wait a second, I'm under AF interface for loopback 0. I just shut down the loopback interface. No, remember, we're in the EIGRP address family named mode configuration for IPv4 under the AF interface loopback 0. So now when I say do show IP EIGRP interfaces, the loopback interface is gone, but is it shut down? Do show int loopback 100. No. The loopback is up and the protocol is up, right? So remember, when you're shutting the interface down in named mode under AF interface for the interface in question, you're shutting down the EIGRP process totally on that interface. So in other words, it's not going to advertise it and it's not going to be sending hellos out the interface, right? It's different from the passive interface because passive simply stops the sending of the hellos and still advertises the interface. Shutdown literally wipes it out. So you're probably asking, well, wait a second, why would I even do that? Why wouldn't I just not run EIGRP on that interface? And that's a valid question. But in the scenario that we have here, where we just slap down the network quad zeros, and let's say that loopback 100 was there already, we obviously don't want EIGRP running, and we don't want that advertised. Maybe it's, you know, an internal IP for something on the management side, who knows? But the shutdown command facilitates basically the shutting down of EIGRP on an interface, not the shutting down of an interface itself. All right, so we're going to back out here into the named mode global configuration section, and now we're going to take a look at address family IPv6 unicast autonomous system 1. And again, there you go. I'm using AS1 both for IPv4 and IPv6, and I think what I had said to you was I was not going to do that. So how about no address family IPv6 unicast AS1? We're going to say address family, or you know what? I'm going to have to use 1 because that's what the other routers are using. All right, sorry about that. So, but it doesn't have to be the same on the same router for v4 and v6, but it does have to be the same, as we would have unfortunately learned had I continued on there using AS100. We wouldn't have learned any information, and there would not have been any adjacencies established. Okay, so this is how you get into the address family configuration mode for IPv6. Now, you're probably asking yourself, okay, cool, Travis, so now I just go to the interfaces under AF interface and fire it up, right? Well, no. So then you're probably thinking, oh, well, wait a minute. You just said we don't have to go under the physical interface. Like, I'm not going to go into interface Ethernet 00 and then have to type in IPv6 router EIGRP1 because you told us we wouldn't have to do that. That we're consolidating the EIGRP configuration. And we are. So look back here at what happened. If you didn't catch that, isn't that interesting? So now here is the good and the bad with the named mode EIGRP for IPv6, and that is, as soon as I say address family IPv6 unicast AS1, every single interface that has an IPv6 address is now running EIGRP for IPv6. So in other words, as soon as I hit enter after address family IPv6 unicast AS1, every single interface that was running IPv6 is now running EIGRP. So do show IPv6 interface brief. And we have three interfaces. So do show IPv6 EIGRP interfaces. Take a look at that. So it's good and it's bad, right? It's good because I don't need to go under every single interface, physical interface configuration section, and I don't need to go under AF interface in order to enable it. It's just automatically enabled. Now, the drawback to this should be obvious, and that is, well, wait a minute. I don't want it to run on every single interface I have IPv6 on for whatever the reason may be. Then what you would have to do is what we've done before, and that's, I'm typically a big fan of AF interface default and then saying passive interface, so passive all interfaces. And you'll notice we're in the IPv6 configuration section. So did it passive all the IPv4s or any of the IPv4 interfaces? No, it didn't. So it only impacts IPv6, and so we know that that's on Ethernet 00. So AF interface Ethernet 00. No passive interface. Boom. Our IPv6 adjacency comes back, and we are 100% whole again. So now let's take a look at do show IPv6 protocols. And you can see here we've got, where are we at? So EIGRP 1, that's our autonomous system number. We've got the K values. We're going to be talking about these this week. And now we have a new member to the composite metrics. And this K6 value, it is an extremely, well, it's a placeholder right now. It's not implemented right now, which is why it's 0. But the information that I have and that's out there that seems to be the popular sentiment is that this is going to end up being a placeholder, but it could be used for something like power, in terms of how much power is the connection pulling, and that would somehow be worked into the equation. So obviously a 100 gig E interface is probably going to draw more power on the chassis than a 100 meg interface or a 1 gig interface. And so this K6 value is sort of a placeholder right now, not implemented fully, but that it's going to be something like that, where you're actually going to be able to evaluate the power draw coming from interfaces, and you could incorporate that into the equation. Metric rib scale, right? You can see the rib scale is 128, and this is inextricably linked right here to metric version 64-bit. So the rib scale we can actually adjust and change to give us a different format for the metrics that we're seeing, because again, they're in 64-bit on a 64-bit scale is what I'm trying to say. So then we have the router ID, because again, we had an IPv4 address there, so we've got the router ID, but take a look. All the other information is the same. The variance is 0, the max hop count still 100, maximum paths, not 4, it's 16 here. The distance, right, administrative distance for internal and external, 90, 170, those are all still the same, and then we get a list of our passive interfaces, and we're not doing any redistribution here. If we were to take a look at the section itself. So how about do show run section EIGRP? And this is really the major benefit of named mode, is that now when I say do show run section EIGRP, we have a single contiguous configuration section for both IPv4 and IPv6, and it's all tightly and nicely packaged here so that we can get a nice look at everything that we would need to see. All right, and what about the topology table? Do show IPv6 EIGRP topo. And again, we've got the sort of ridiculously large metric numbers that we're dealing with because of the 64-bit. And you can also, like I said, it's backward compatible. So if a router is not running named mode, like I believe HQ, let's check it out. Is HQ running named mode? Show run section EIGRP. And it clearly is not. So show IP route EIGRP, and there you go. And so HQ is still evaluating those metrics on a 32-bit scale. Excuse me. And that's okay. We've got full interoperability. There are, and I guess I should mention, that there are some corner case scenarios where if you had a bunch of IPv6 speakers, not IPv6, a bunch of named mode speakers, right? So we'll say that these are 64-bit named, actually I'll just put in here for named mode, right? Named mode, and we'll put another one over here for name mode. And then we had a name mode set over here, and they were going through classic mode routers, right? That these guys right here are not 64-bit. They're not running EIGRP name mode. There are some corner case scenarios where you could run into some issues, right? But again, they're definitely the exception and not the rule, but something to be aware of so that if you decided, hey, well, I'm going to jump into my environment and it's a hitless change for me to say EIGRP upgrade CLI, again, there's no outage required. You can convert your configuration from 32 to 64-bit mode with that single command, EIGRP, upgrade CLI, boom, it's done. But remember, the metrics are now on a 64-bit scale, not a 32-bit scale. So if you're doing that, you probably want to work your way through the entire environment and make that happen. Okay, so the last thing that we're going to do is we're going to talk about summarization. Again, sort of easing our way into things here, and we're going to do the summary on branch 1 for, is it branch 1 or 2? Yeah, we're going to do it on branch 2 because branch 2 actually has 2 addresses there, the .2 and the .3. So we're on branch 2, do show IP interface brief. And we've got the .2 and the .3. So in order to figure out the summary for the .2 and the .3, whoops, we know the interesting, I was going to say octet. We know the interesting octet. I was almost going to say hextet, I mean. We know the interesting octet, so 2 is going to look like this, 0010, and 3, 0011. So it's right there. The first 16 bits are the same, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. It's going to be a /23, and it's going to be 192.168.2.0/23. So let's clear the screen, and we'll come over here. And remember, again, this is when we're using name mode, this is the change. All of your EIGRP configuration is now under the EIGRP configuration mode, named mode. It is no longer, I have to go under an interface to do this. So our physical interface configuration section is what I should say, because you're about to see we have to go to the address family interface. So address family, IPv4, I don't have to say unicast AS1, AF interface, and we are doing this out of Ethernet 00. So again, all I have to say here is summary, no IP summary, just summary address 192.168.2.0/23. And that is my summary. Again, graceful resync, do show run, section EIGRP. And there's my name mode configuration. And where is, there it is, AF interface, Ethernet 00. all packaged nice and neat right here under the IPv4 address family. Our IPv6 information is also right there. Again, if you wanted to, I recommend go ahead, come up with a summary for IPv6, go into the address family IPv6 unicast under Ethernet AF interface Ethernet 00, and then put in your summary address command. All right, so we're on step 13. They're talking about the passive interface, and we've already done that because, again, remember that as soon as we enable EIGRP, the address family for IPv6 under EIGRP named mode, that's going to turn the EIGRP process on every single interface running and has an IPv6 address, and that may or may not be what you want. All right, well, that is going to wrap up our intro into EIGRP named mode. Again, the key takeaways here: the metrics are now on a 64-bit scale. So the values that you're going to be working with are much larger and a little more onerous than the 32-bit. And you'll hear the name mode referred to as 64-bit mode because of the 64-bit metrics. Also remember that when you use the shutdown command under an AF interface, you're not shutting the physical interface down. You're simply shutting the EIGRP process, which may be running on that interface, down. And that's when you don't want the interface to be advertised. For something you want to apply to all interfaces, go under AF interface default. All right, well, that's going to wrap up EIGRP named mode, and this is the last discovery activity for Chapter 2. Enjoy your weekend, and I will see you all on Monday.